So he was watching Hall and Nash, and he was seeing this stuff, and he was, seeing Nash powerbomb Eric Bischoff off the stage at Great American Bash, something that you never really saw before. Like, so Hogan is here watching this and getting really interested. Like, what, this is really interesting stuff. So he calls Bischoff and says, "Hey, I wanna sit down and meet with you." And Hogan right away, no small talk, just goes, "So who's the third man?" He said, "Who do you think it should be?" And Hogan, takes a puff of his cigar, has got a cigar between his teeth, and says, "You're looking at him, brother." And that was it.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Crime and Entertainment. Got a very special guest here. Please welcome Marc Raimondi. Marc, how you doing, my friend?
I'm doing great, man. How are you?
I'm good. Look here, you got a book just hit the shelf. Say Hello to the Bad Guys. You can actually see, I think that's the cover right over your shoulder over there. And this kind of centers around the original members of the NWO, Hogan, Hall, Nash, aka Razor Ramon, Diesel, depending on what you grew up watching. I guess let's just jump right into it, man. How did this book come about for you?
Ooh, that's a good question. So I've been a wrestling fan for my entire life, right? I mean,
Likewise.
going back to I was born in '84. I'm 40, so I started watching wrestling in the early '90s. I think around 1990, and it's just been a part of my life since then. And that period of time was such a formative part of my life, right? I was 11 when the NWO started in '96, and then it carried me through my preteen and teen years, the Attitude Era and whatnot. And it was just something that was really just an important part of my life back then. And as I got older and I started, becoming an adult and still watching wrestling, maybe not the level that I was, although I do watch quite a bit of it now over the last few years. I've always felt like if you know what you're looking at and looking for, you can see wrestling in so many different things. You can see wrestling everywhere to me, whether that's like sports talk, the manufactured conflict. It's like, the people cutting promos on each other,
Yeah.
on these shows. Cable news is the same way. It's just like it's all talking heads and it's all, these people shouting and it's like 80s wrestling promos on these shows. And social media is like people putting on personas and posting the photos and the videos that they want you to see. It's not really who they are, but it's what their character is almost on social media. So I grew up and I'm like, oh, this is all wrestling. This is like, these are all characters and this is all manufactured conflict. And I would always just tell my buddies like, oh, that's wrestling or everything is wrestling. And they'd probably roll their eyes at me. And I had no way to, adequately express that. I had no vehicle to express that necessarily, but I am a writer. I'm a journalist. I work for ESPN and I cover the Atlanta Falcons right now. That's my main gig. But I used to cover combat sports, mostly the UFC. That was my main job for 11 years, covering the UFC. And along with that, I did a little bit of boxing, I did a little bit of pro wrestling stuff. And in 2019, I did an article about the NWO going into the WWE Hall of Fame. And I completely overwrote this story, man. Like I just put a lot of like passion, a lot of heart and soul into this piece because it meant so much to me. I put the cultural context, what it meant, why it was such a big deal, the impact. And I wrote that story with a lot of, a lot of soul. Fast forward a year and a half later, I get an email. I'm sitting in Houston, Texas. I'm there for a UFC fight there. It was May 2021. So this is 4 years ago. And I get an email from an editor from Simon and Schuster, one of the biggest book publishers, right, in the world. And this editor is asking me if I want to write a book about the NWO. They saw my article. They were trying to do an NWO book, and they thought this is our guy. This is he clearly knows what he's talking about because he wrote this article probably bigger and more passionate than it really could and should have been. And they wanted to do a book, and I was like, yeah, absolutely, of course. There was a whole, there was a little bit more to it than that, but yeah, that's pretty much how it all. That's the origin story.
Yeah. Now, there's often been a lot of talk about, it was down to the wire if Hogan was actually going to be the third man. There was talks that it was Sting, and then, other people. There's been God knows everybody that's been rumored to be that third guy. And I know you weren't actually able to talk to Hogan. I think you said Hogan and Nash you weren't able to talk to, and for this, you interviewed Bischoff.
And I talked to Nash, but not at the level that I wanted to. I wanted to go and sit down with him and spend
Okay.
time with him. I was not able to do that. We did talk on the phone, but it wasn't as much as I wanted.
Okay. Was it that close of a down to the wire decision of Hogan turning? Because he did start off as a villain, for people that go way back before, the immortal Hulk Hogan. So he had experience at being the villain, but now he's ridden this red and yellow, say your prayers, take your vitamins, train hard, all that. He's ridden that, till the wheels are about to come off, so to speak. Was it down to the wire for him to make that decision?
It really was. It really was. So it was his idea initially to do this. And what I mean by that is, so Hall and Nash come in to WCW from the WWF. They were Razor Ramon and Diesel, as you mentioned at the top.
Right.
And the idea for them, that Eric Bischoff, who was the head of WCW, the idea for them to come in was they were going to be like invaders. They were going to be these intruders, and it was going to feel like, or at least seem like, or it was going to be implied that they were coming down from WWF. Right? That was the big idea. Right?
Which was a very smart play. I think he said he got that from somewhere in Japan or something, but
There
it
was
was
a there was
very
a similar thing that they did in Japan, and I think there was some inspiration that Bischoff took. He doesn't like to say that he took, like, he doesn't like to admit that he took it,
yeah,
from them, but certainly there was an inspiration there, right? So Hall and Nash come in, and it's compelling television, right? Hall shows up first, and Macon, Georgia comes down the stands into the ring. No one expects him to be there. No one knows why he's there. Nash follows 2 weeks later, and it's this compelling thing, and you're starting to see like, oh, WCW's got something cooking here, because don't forget they were always the second-rate promotion. They were never a big deal. It was always the WWF. WWF was like the Kleenex of pro wrestling, right? Everyone associated wrestling with WWF the same way they do WWE now. But WCW had something cooking with these guys, and the storyline was starting to click, and people were interested in it, and they were teasing this third man. Like, it was going to be Hall and Nash, and they were going to bring somebody else to face the best guys in WCW. So Hogan is not on television at this time. He's not with WCW. He's off doing a movie in LA called Santa with Muscles. That was the movie that he was doing.
yep,
So Jimmy Hart, who was his real life manager, and also he was with a lot with him in the early days of WCW on television as well. So Jimmy Hart, always been close to Hulk Hogan. He would send Hogan FedEx VHS tapes of Nitro the next morning. You would ship them overnight, Tuesday morning, send them to California, where Hogan was taping Santa with Muscles. So when in his downtime from doing the movie, Hogan would pop in the VHS to the VCR, and he would follow along what was happening on Nitro, because he wanted to keep in touch what was happening. Sorry, excuse me, what was happening in WCW. So he was watching Hall and Nash, and he was seeing this stuff, and he was seeing Nash powerbomb Eric Bischoff off the stage at Great American Bash, something that you never really saw before, like an announcer, getting attacked, violently. That was not something that you really saw in wrestling before. So Hogan is here watching this and getting really interested, like, what, this is really interesting stuff. So he calls Bischoff and says, hey, I wanna sit down and meet with you. Let's talk about where I'm going, what my next move is going to be in WCW. So Bischoff flies to LA, and Bischoff's thinking like, Hogan wasn't in the immediate plans at that point. It was May 96 or June 96. And he didn't think Hogan was going to be coming back from this break until the fall, maybe October, something like that. So he had an idea for him maybe down the road, but it wasn't fresh in his mind because he was dealing with this Hall and Nash stuff. So Bischoff travels to LA, lands, takes a taxi to Calabasas, California, where Hogan was doing the movie in the hills, right? And he goes to Hogan's trailer. It's late at night already. He pulls up, and Hogan is there. He's got a cigar in his mouth. He's got the Miller Lite cooler, which he always had with him, next to him in the trailer. And Hogan right away, no small talk, just goes, "So who's the third man?" And Bischoff is like taken aback because he didn't expect that to be the question. In fact, he didn't even know for sure that Hogan was even following what was going on in WCW.
Right.
So Bischoff doesn't want to say that it's going to be Sting because that was the initial idea. It was going to be Sting as the third man. But Bischoff doesn't want to say that to Hogan because Hogan, has a few beers, tells his buddy tells somebody else. All of a sudden, it's in the wrestling dirt sheets, right? So he didn't want to say anything. So he said, "Who do you think it should be?" And Hogan, takes a puff of his cigar, has got a cigar between his teeth, and says, "You're looking at him, brother." And that was it. And that was what right. That was the line. And Bischoff's like, wow. And immediately Bischoff's like, oh, that's a way better idea than Sting would have been, right? Hogan is a much bigger star. Hogan turning heel and joining this group is cataclysmic. It's a huge deal.
Yeah.
But Bischoff never thought that that could even be a thing because a year earlier, he pitched the idea of Hogan turning heel to Hogan at his home in Tampa, and Hogan basically escorted him out of all the premises. Like Hogan pretty much said, "F you, or I'm not doing that." So Bischoff didn't even think that was something that could have been on the table, but it was. And Hogan was very interested in this storyline in particular and what it could mean for him and what him turning heel and how that could affect the greater story and the greater ecosystem of what was going on in WCW. So anyway, Hogan says he's going to do it, but Bischoff still has his doubts. It's like Hogan, again, turned him down a year earlier, and Bischoff also knew that people around Hogan were not a big fan of him turning heel. His agent, Peter Young, not a fan of it because his agent is thinking movie roles and TV roles and all the other stuff that Hogan would do, the signings, the meet and greets, the good guys are the ones who do all that stuff. They're the ones who get all those opportunities. The bad guys in wrestling don't usually. So his agent's like, I don't know about this whole heel thing. His ex-wife, his then wife, Linda, was not a fan of this idea either. So there were people in Hogan's inner circle that were not a fan of him going heel. So Bischoff felt like at any moment someone could change his mind. Someone could sit down with that and have a conversation with him and change his mind, and he's not going to do it. So what they did is the night of Bash at the Beach, when he's supposed to go heel and join up and form this group, the NWO, he has Hogan stay with Kevin Sullivan, who was the head of creative of WCW.
Mhm.
It was Hogan and his agent, Peter Young, staying at Kevin Sullivan's townhouse in Daytona Beach, which was just a few blocks away from where the arena was, the Ocean Center, where the pay-per-view was taking place. So basically, Kevin Sullivan's job that night was to babysit Hogan and make sure that no one got in his ear and told him, hey, this is a bad idea. So that's kind of what happened. So Kevin Sullivan did his job. No one was able to convince Hogan otherwise. And he arrived to the arena that day with the intent of turning heel. Bischoff saw him in the afternoon. They spoke about it. And that's when he knew for sure that Hogan would do it. The thing was, though, is that Bischoff didn't tell anyone else because, again, he was so afraid of it getting out. You just don't want something like that getting out. And it still happens today. I don't know if you're watching the show WWE Unreal on Netflix, but the way they protected John Cena's heel turn was very much in the same vein. They only told the people who absolutely needed to know in that moment. And that's kind of what Bischoff did. But Bischoff didn't even tell Hall and Nash. Hall and Nash knew there was a possibility that Hogan was going to do it, right? But they were not sure. They were not 100% sure until it came through the curtain, and then it ended up happening. So that was the whole background of how it ended up happening. And they really felt like until the 11th hour, they did not know for certain what Hogan would do, and Sting was going to be the backup in case something went wrong.
Well, I think it worked out for everybody because, I grew up, I was born in 83, and I grew up, right after WrestleMania. I vaguely remember WrestleMania 3, like bits and pieces, but I was really sinking my teeth into WrestleMania 4. We had the tournament where Savage won, and the Mega Powers explode in 5, and then I was hooked after that. And so, yeah, you're getting a little tired of Hogan, but at the same time, he's like that grandpa you just like. You know what I'm saying? He's up in age. And I largely think if he hadn't made this decision, I don't know if the Hulk Hogan character would have been able to survive in what the wrestling business became. But by him turning heel, it breathed life into his character. It probably put Sting over way more than he would have ever gotten over anywhere else. And then Hall and Nash were very much in their prime anyway, and coming in using their real names, it just kind of elevated them even higher. So it was really the perfect move. And it was, I remember watching that and just my jaw was on the floor. And I know everybody said, man, it's just, I was like, it doesn't matter. If you've been following wrestling as long as I have, like you said, this was a cataclysmic turn of somebody you never expected to do this. And the ring was littered with trash. People were throwing drinks and everything else. I mean, it was serious there for a while. Fans were trying to storm the ring. And they had a great thing. I will say my opinion as time went on, I think they watered down the own product by adding so many people to the NWO. Did you get that feeling from anyone when you were doing your research for the book?
Yeah, that is absolutely one of the big criticisms of the group, and I think it's a very valid criticism. But I do think it's actually a little bit overblown, and let me explain to you why I feel that way. So by the end of '96, right, just a few months into the storyline, they had already added Michael Wall Street, VK
Yeah,
Wall Street, the former IRS. They had
IRS,
already added Big Bubba, Ray Traylor, the
yeah,
former Big
trailer.
Boss Man. They had already added guys like that, and there were a few others before the end of '96. Then in '97, Scott Norton, guys like that. So they had already added kind of like mid carders, lower mid carders at that point, and the business was only just getting started. '97 was a big year, and then '98 was a massive year. So despite it was already bloated by the end of '96, just a few months, into the storyline, into the group, and the business was still doing great. It really, I mean, they could have made it work with what they had they just had better creative down the stretch in '98 and '99, especially. That was really the key. I think that certainly the bloated nature of the group hurt them, and it did get more bloated, right? There was like the NWOB team in '98 and '99 with Stevie Ray and Vincent, the former Virgil, and
Yeah.
folks like that. But I really think that there was a way to do that better than they did it. And I think that the creative is really the big reason why it failed. And it got very monotonous. Like they never let anyone really no one in WCW ever really got over on the NWO. And when Sting was supposed to be the guy to do that, they kind of cut him off at the knees. Hogan and whoever else, cut him off at the knees. And I think that is the bigger reason why it did not end up sustaining for longer. But hey, look, it was a great run though. I mean, it was a
Oh, it was.
several-year run of incredible business.
Yeah, even when they split and went red and black, you kind of that breathed a little bit more life into it. They had the very cool entrance music with the Wolfpack brand and the money off merchandise that these people made. Did Hogan have a piece of the merchandising in that?
He was the only one who did.
You shit me.
No one
Really?
else did. Bischoff didn't. Hall and Nash didn't. No one else did except for Hogan.
So when he said this is the new world order of professional wrestling, brother, in that interview, the promo he cut after he turned and bashed the beach, was that off the top of his head or that was planned that this was NWO?
A little bit of both. So the name New World Order was given to Hogan by Bischoff the day of Bash of the Beach in the afternoon when they had their meeting. That
Okay.
was the first time that. So the funny thing about it is that for a long time, Bischoff took credit for that name that he came up with it. The truth is that the Nitro before Bash of the Beach in July '96, Larry Zbyszko, the color commentator for Nitro,
Yeah, I know Larry.
actually referred to Hall and Nash and what they were doing as a New World Order. So he was actually the one who first coined the phrase. And Bischoff now admits that maybe he heard it on the broadcast and it was in his head and he said it. But for a long time, he didn't even realize that's where he got it from. But it was actually Larry Zbyszko.
Nice. And I know you've told the story about, the whoever wrote that logo, and you make a great point. You've said in other interviews, like, they had to really kind of fly by the seat of their pants because they didn't know how this thing was going to go. Nowadays, like you say, somebody cuts a promo, you got a shirt as soon as the promo's over. Everything is so scripted. But man, Hogan must have made, I mean, you couldn't go nowhere without seeing an NWO shirt, even when they split and went red and black. I've got a red and black one upstairs still through all these years. That had to be a massive boost financially to the brand.
Oh, it was massive. I think I forget the exact figure, but when the merchandising, the head of merchandising for WCW, her name was Kelly Merwin. That's her name now. I think her name was Kelly Kominsk, but she got married, and it's that was her maiden name. But she told me that when she started in WCW, like in '93 and '94, it was like the merchandise was like they were making like five figures a year. That's it.
Mhm.
In the 20,000s, 30,000s. By the time that she finished, they were making, I think, 20 million. It was like an insane difference in what they were doing because the merchandise was not very big for WCW. In fact, I mean, wrestling merchandise wasn't very big. It was big. The Four Horsemen shirts were popular. There were some things that were popular. Hulkamania shirts were
Yeah.
popular, right? Hulk Hogan shirts. But other than that, it wasn't a big deal where everyone had shirts. I mean, it was really that era of wrestling that launched that merchandise craze where it became NWO, Austin 316, D-Generation X, so on and so forth. And now it's carried over to now where, everyone has their own merchandise, everyone has their own shirt. It's a big part of what, wrestling is and the culture of wrestling.
100%. And I can't say as though, like being a wrestling fan myself, that they were the first cool bad guys, but I think they were the first ones to do it in mainstream. I mean, when you're talking cool bad guys, you really do have to give that nod to WCW. They had the Freebirds and they had the Four Horsemen, and when they had their feuds with Dusty and all that. I mean, that was some classic stuff. But when you got into what would eventually become the Attitude Era, they were just bad guys that it was cool to like. And, I was an NWO fan, as you can see the name down there, Hollywood Hogan. It was given to me for a different reason, but I didn't mind it because I loved, Hogan in the black and white. It was such freshness, and it was just something to be able to cool to cheer for the bad guy. And
I'm glad you mentioned that too because that is so true. The Freebirds were that act in Dallas and in other places where they were the cool heels. The one thing that I think made the NWO different is that they were the heels that people rooted for, but they were also the protagonists of the show. They were
yeah,
the ones that the whole show was centered around, and that was not the case for some of those the Four Horsemen to a degree, but it was still always the baby faces as like the leading man. And that
right.
really changed a lot with the NWO because Hulk Hogan, Hollywood Hogan, was the leading man in WCW as the heel.
Mhm. If you had to pinpoint the one segment or the one area where it started to decline, because make no mistake about it, this come out like a rocket ship and it rode, even though they added a lot of people to the roster, they really didn't need to. And sometimes maybe that's just to boost that wrestler's credibility, because you could put a shirt on them and they became a star, automatically just by default. At what point do you think the decline began?
That is a really good question, and I think my feeling is that it started at Starrcade '97. I really
Mm.
believe that that's when the decline started.
That's the Sting and Hogan, right?
Correct. It was Hogan Sting, and I have a lot about this in the book about what people remember happening, what actually happened, what should have happened, and so on and so forth. But basically, without getting too in the weeds, Sting should have been the guy to go over strong against Hogan and kind of be the one to really defeat the NWO at a high level for the first time. And he did not do that. That
Mm.
there was some machinations that went on. It didn't happen. It was a very bad finish that made no sense. It was incoherent.
Yeah.
And I think that started the decline. And when I say it started the decline, I'm talking about the creative decline because that was at the end of '97, and then '98 was actually a better business year than '97 was for WCW. They were killing it, as far as the business in '98. But to me, the creative started going downhill beginning at Starrcade '97, and I didn't think the creative in '98 was all that great compared to '96 and '97. So the business kind of takes a little bit longer to catch up because you develop that trust in the product as a fan, right? And you're watching and you're paying the money for the tickets and the pay-per-views and whatnot. It takes a little bit for the creative to get bad for you to say like this sucks now. Like this is not any good. I'm not going to pay my money. So it took a little bit for the business to catch up to the creative. So the business
Mhm.
was like up here and the creative was down here. But I would say Starcade '97. And one thing that I want to note also is that the day so Starcade '97 was a debacle, right? It should have been Sting as the winner. They built that up for 16 months. The guy didn't talk or wrestle for 16 months
Yeah.
with the idea that he was going to be the guy to avenge WCW and win the title and beat Hogan.
Strangest but best build up probably ever of any heavyweight championship match ever.
Yeah, best build up ever, right? Best storyline ever, you know? Except for the end of it. Except for they did not nail the dismount. It's like having like a perfect routine in like a gymnastics and then just eating shit, on the way down. And that's what it was. It was horrible. And Sting did end up winning the title at Starrcade, but no one felt like he did because it was such a bad finish.
Yeah.
And then what people forget is that they had a chance, Wade. They had a chance to at least correct it. They had a chance to kind of like, all right, it was a mess, but we can stitch it back up. We can patch it back up and make it make sense. They actually made it worse. The next night on Nitro, they did the rematch, Hogan and Sting, right? People forget this because Starrcade 97 is the one that people talk about. But the next night on Nitro, Hogan and Sting rematch. The show goes off the air before the match ends. And fans are like, what the hell is going on? They don't show the finish of the match until a week and a half later on the premiere of the new show Thunder. It was a ratings ploy, right? So that's how you treat your fans after a year and a half of loyal fans, making you the winner, right? You're beating WWF in the ratings every week because the fans are freaking zoned in on your and locked in on your product. And then you say, hey, F you, we're going to make you wait a week and a half to see the finish of this match. And then it wasn't even a good finish because the belt ended up being vacated anyway. So no one was the champion after that. So it was just a mess that they actually made worse rather than better. And I think that was really the beginning of like, you from a creative perspective, you build credibility with the audience. You build something, you build a trust. Where again, it's like as a fan, it's your money and your time. These things are very valuable, right? And then all of a sudden they go and do that, and it's like, wait, what? I just invested all of this time and like emotion too into this product, and then you're doing this crap. And that's I think where it really started to go downhill is when they basically just said like to the fans, and that's when it happened in December 97, January 98.
Yeah. And then when you get into, Nash, I think became the booker at some point. And I think when you give active talent booking control, things can always get a little dicey behind the stage. And I don't know if Nash necessarily took advantage, but it definitely caused rifts.
Hulk Hogan wasn't on the booking committee, but he had creative control, and he would and if he didn't like something, he would just rewrite it. He would get to the arena and start rewriting stuff, that he didn't like.
Yeah, that didn't work for me, brother.
And that's exactly, and that's why there were so many plot holes because it was like the creative team had this like narrative that they were trying to like, this through line of the narrative that they wanted to create, and then Hogan would come in on day 3 and say, "Ah, we're gonna do it differently today," and then it didn't end up making any sense.
Yeah. Well, Mark, I'm glad you could come on the show. I know you're a little short on time. You're a busy guy promoting this thing. So we certainly appreciate you carving out some time to talk wrestling. You're welcome back here anytime. Real quick before we get out of here, plug any socials you got. Tell everybody where they can go find the book.
I'm good enough. Yeah, thank you. So the book's available everywhere: Amazon, Barnes and Noble, pretty much anywhere you pick up your books, independent bookstores. If they don't have it on the shelves, you can call and have them order it. And then as far as social media, I'm on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it. It's just at Marc Raimondi, MarcRaimondi. And then Instagram is the same, but with sports on the end. And most of my book stuff and wrestling stuff is on Instagram. I kind of keep the Twitter for my regular job, which is covering the Atlanta Falcons. So it's gonna be very weird because like my Twitter is entirely football and my Instagram is entirely wrestling right now. So it's a little bit weird, but I wear many hats. Wade, what can I tell you?
Well, there you go. I'll follow on your Instagram for sure. I'm a Panthers fan, so I don't know how much close I follow on your X. So we're better. I'm in Charleston, actually.
In Charleston, okay. So so I imagine you grew up a little bit of a Four Horsemen guy, and
Very much. I really honestly, man, I grew up, even though I was a more WWF person, I always thought WCW had the cooler guys. They had the guys that were always a little bit more edgy. It was definitely until these guys over your shoulder here come in that Vince finally changed the narrative from the cartoony characters to the TL Hoppers and Duke Droseys until you got the Stone Colds and the Rocks and DXs and stuff like that was able to combat that, which kind of turned the table from the 96 weeks or whatever it was that they were losing. And I always thought WCW had the edge on the bad guys.
Yeah, I always I was a and I know that there weren't many, but I was a fan of WCW in the in the early 90s. I
Mhm.
thought they had a good product. I enjoyed it, like with Vader and Cactus Jack,
Yep.
and Vader was with Harley Race, right? Sting with the Surfer Sting. I Ricky Steamboat was in there in like '92. Like Brian Pillman, Jushin Liger. There was some cool stuff. Stunning Steve Austin.
Yep.
Remember
Yep, with the Hollywood Blondes, yep, Stunning Steve.
happened to that guy?
Yeah.
Stunning Steve Austin. But
Yep.
yeah, I always enjoyed.
Terrorizing those there.
Exactly. A lot of
Went
those
on to
guys were
become a
there.
pretty important guy in WWE.
It's actually kind of wild all the talent that WCW had and really did not do anything with. And I would even say in the NWO era, they had Chris Jericho, they had Chris Benoit, they had Eddie Guerrero, they had Rey Mysterio, they had Conan. They had these guys who were incredible, stars who went on and became big deals elsewhere, and they really didn't do anything with them. I was on Jericho's podcast a few weeks ago, and he was saying that they just couldn't, they would not elevate anyone. It was just the same guys over and over again, and no one ever got elevated except for Goldberg because they just had no choice. He got so big, he got so popular that they had to push him a little bit.
And that helped them because I think they weren't even really paying attention. Bischoff would give them time, and it was up to them to do creative. And out of those guys you just named on the undercard of WCW, I think probably 4, maybe more of those guys went on to be champion in WWE. So they had the roster and they had the talent. I just think they had such a big ball of clay to mold and use with the NWO. You just, there's only so much time on television and you're only going to be able to share it with so long. But Vince, I think, far more had the eyes for creative and plans for people than I think Bischoff did. Bischoff had great ideas and he was able to make this NWO thing pop. But Vince, long term, I don't think anybody can beat him as far as character development.
Yeah, the mid card in WCW, sorry, WWF, it wasn't actually that, like, the talent wasn't as good, but they made the most of the talent in the
Yes.
Attitude Era, right? Like they got guys over who really weren't that, like the Godfather. Like he just had a great character, like Val Venus. Like they weren't that good, but everyone had characters, everyone had their stories, and it worked. And WCW was like, these guys are way better than the other guys, but they have no story. They're not pushing. They just don't. They obviously, like, you could tell they didn't care because you're watching the matches in the mid card. You're watching like these luchadors do some crazy shit, and Tony Schiavone's talking about the NWO. He's talking about Hollywood Hulk Hogan, and it's like Super Calo's like flipping on his head, and it's like they don't care. They're not even talking about it.
I had Charles Wright on the show a while back, and he said he loved that Godfather gimmick because he said I was always going first. He said that was the closest version of anything that I portrayed that was me. I mean, he owned strip clubs in Vegas. That was very much a persona of him outside of Kama and Papa Shango and everything else that he was. And he said, man, I got to come on first, do it, and then get out of there and be at the bar smoking, smoking whatever he smokes by the time the show was over. He loved it. He hated when they made him go what was that, right to censor, where it was against everything. Yeah, he said the only reason he stuck around was they put the straps on him for a couple months, and he's like, I'll stick around for that. When they took the straps off, he's like, Vince, I'm gone.
The Godfather was so over. Like he was so over. He was like so over. He could have had like a title run. Like it would have been credible for him to have a title run because he was so over.
The only one that was about to break the Undertaker's character, I don't know if you've seen that clip. I'm sure you have, where he's like, I know you like hoes. And Undertaker said like he's had to bite his lip to keep from breaking up with that. He was a great character, man. This I could talk wrestling with you all day long, brother. You got to get out of here, right? You short on time.
I do. But you know what? Let's do it again. Let's do it again.
Yeah,
A couple months from now, maybe when the NFL season is over and my life is a little bit back to normal. Let's do it again. We'll chat about whatever you want.
for sure, man. We'll keep you in the loop. Again, thank you for coming on the show. I definitely appreciate it. Everybody go check out, say hello to the bad guys. We'll put links here in the description, not only for the book, but for your podcast, your socials as well. Mark, thank you for stopping by the show, my friend.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it.
Thank you, brother.